everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 148 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, keep your chin up. You might need it because we're going to talk about military neck posture. If you got someone who has a chin down and they're going to frown worse than Charlie Brown, this is definitely the debrief you want to talk about. If you got someone who's got that double, triple chin action and, you want to undouble chin themselves, but you're unsure where to start, especially if you got someone who's got a little bit of neck tension or a bunch of other wild and crazy things, folks, this is the debrief for you because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam, recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first and only question today comes from David, or as I frequently like to mispronounce, David. And here's what this fine individual asks. I've been enjoying the cervical extension test to help determine hyoid position. However, I had an issue last week where it didn't work. This client had a military posture. We did the assessment, but as they opened their mouth, they got no additional cervical extension at all. Usually, additional cervical extension is expected with military neck posture. The result threw me off. However, the person did have zero shoulder internal rotation, and I'm wondering if that had any influence on the cervical extension test. Thanks, homie. You're welcome, fam. Military head posture. Let's dive into this. What is it? Well, I'm glad you asked. A military head posture is basically when someone has this type of double chin-ish looking presentation. They might not always present with a double chin, but that's kind of what it is. And if we break it down into what's going on the back side of the neck and the front side of the neck, we can see how this relates to the cervical extension test or the hyoid position test, which has been ever popularized. And kudos to Daddy-O Pops himself, Bill Hartman, for making it a thing. If you're not following him, you'll definitely want to check him out. And I'll link him in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/military-head-posture. Military neck, looking like this. What's happening in the cervical spine is you have upper cervical OA flexion, lower cervical extension. If we go to the front side of the neck and we're looking at hyoid musculature, aka the hyoid, which is this middle bone in your neck, stuff above, which is suprahyoid, and stuff below, which is infrahyoid. Those are the muscles that we are looking at when determining concentric and eccentric orientations. In military neck positioning, you're going to have suprahyoid, stuff above the hyoid, being more concentric, and stuff below the hyoid, infrahyoid musculature, being more eccentric. Now, the test that David is referring to, this hyoid position test, kudos to Daddy-O Pops for it, is a lot of times if you see someone who has a concentric orientation of hyoid musculature, and it could be supra or infra, what will happen is as you test cervical extension, you keep your teeth together, and you tip your head back. If you open the mouth at the point of end range that your supreme clientele exhibits, oftentimes you'll see an increase in range of motion. So they might bite, tip back, and then when they open, they'll be able to go way further. And the reason why this is because the opening of the mouth can create an eccentric orientation in some of the hyoid musculature, which can allow for an increase in range of motion. Now, David says in this case that with military neck, you should see an increase. But I want to be clear, you could see an increase with the exact opposite posture, which would be a forward head posture, which would be the reverse of a military neck, where you're dealing with upper cervical extension and lower cervical flexion. Either presentation can have an increase in range of motion when opening the mouth at cervical extension, the differentiator between the two is location, 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 aka where do they increase their extension from? Typically, it's going to be wherever they were more flexed or concentrically oriented on the front side. So in the case of someone who's got a forward head posture, in this situation, the infrahyoid musculature is concentrically oriented. So when they tip back, if they open, that will allow for there to be eccentric orientation of the infrahyoid musculature, which will allow for the lower cervical spine to induce more extension. So you'll see changes in the lower cervical curve assisting in extension. You might not see as much movement upstairs because they're already in extension. So it's not like they can move any further into that range. Flip-flop that, in this case, for the military neck, which I think is a little bit easier to see. In this situation, when they tip the head back, because remember, folks, upper cervical with military neck is in a flexed position, and they open. That eccentrically orients the suprahyoid musculature, which allows you to tip your head back further. And so if we envision this imaginary cutoff point between upper and lower cervical, you might see the upper part of the neck tip backwards. Now, what about, though, with the situation David is referring to? I didn't see that. What's going on there, and how does that relate to shoulder internal rotation? Well, folks, with a military neck posture, theoretically, the suprahyoid musculature should be concentrically oriented, and the hyoid will be a bit more elevated. The infrahyoid musculature ought to be eccentrically oriented. Now, you might be wondering, where does the infrahyoid musculature attach aside from the hyoid? The answer, folks, is the manubrium and the sternum. In theory, if this is eccentrically oriented, this being the infrahyoid musculature, the sternum is going to be more elevated because it's going to pull up on that position, aka you can get more air into the front side of your body. But, folks, if I have a loss of internal rotation, and internal rotation is associated with anterior expansion, then what you're dealing with in this case is boom, 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 a double concentric orientation. What you're going to do about it, you're not going to get cervical extension. That's what you're not going to do about it. Anyways, in that situation, now I have concentric orientation of both supra and infrahyoid musculature. So what's going to happen in this case then is when they do cervical extension and they open the mouth, well, there's no place for the hyoid to go because I have concentric orientation of supra and infra. So I'm not going to have any dynamic capabilities there. Thus, what oftentimes happens is you don't get the change that you are so desiring when looking at the hyoid position test. And in my opinion, it's one of the shortcomings of that particular test. I might have some better options for you to look at instead. So if someone's got a concentric supra and infra, either what will happen is you won't see any change, they'll be limited in cervical extension, or they'll do some type of compensatory activity through the remainder of the thorax, causing them to tip backwards. Maybe they'll arch their back a little bit, giving them the semblance of pseudo cervical extension. Either way, the hyoid position test isn't going to give you the information you are looking for when it comes to if I have dynamic capabilities of the hyoid. So with this particular presentation, what do? We have to look into what are all of the factors that contribute to making this area of my neck more mobile so I can demilitarify the military head posture. AKA, if they are someone who's got OA flexion, they have compression in the infrahyoid musculature as well, the pump handle is down. We got to flip-flop all of that. And we do that by a 3-step process. Step 1, We have to make them more like the initial primary compensation of a military neck posture, which is often associated with wide infrasternal angles, but not always. In the initial is concentric supra, eccentric infra. We have to get the infrahyoid, which is now in a concentric orientation, to be improved. AKA, we need to get an increase in shoulder internal rotation, or better, put some air in the front of the chest. There's a couple of different moves that you can try to do that if you're dealing with someone who's a wide infrasternal angle presentation. This is oftentimes improved by making the infrasternal angle dynamic. You can utilize a 110, 120 degree reach, which will do the wonders of compressing the lateral dimensions of the rib cage, and it will allow for front to back expansion, making your pump handle mobile AF. If you're dealing with someone who's a narrow infrasternal angle presentation, gotta still put air in the front, but you might utilize a move such as quadruped. Lazy bear is a great choice. Anything that's reaching at 90 degrees of shoulder flexion can work quite well. Step 1, get air into the front of the chest first. Once you have that, your next step is to work on eccentrically orienting the suprahyoid musculature. To me, there's a 2-step process that you have to undergo to make this happen. Step 1 would be driving OA extension. Remember, folks, with the military neck, you get that double chin action going on. So you gotta undouble chin someone. Simply cueing OA extension and using that cue, undouble chin, can be quite useful. However, there are many ways that your supreme clientele can screw this up. A lot of times when people do that, they might jut their head forward, which is undesirable. I'm not trying to induce a forward head. I want to isolate this to just the cranium doing the motion. The other thing that they might do is they might tip their head way back like this, which is also undesirable because now you're occluding the airway and you're essentially getting OA extension and lower cervical extension. You do that, you're going to have a bad time. So what we want to cue our wonderful folks with is a slight undouble chin. You do that, that will help bias the suprahyoid musculature to being in more of an eccentrically oriented position. A lot of times that can help depress the hyoid. Life is good, in theory. But folks, I must readily admit, the hyoid position test is something that I've moved away from for a lot of the reasons that I've mentioned. If someone's got a double concentric in the front of the neck, you might have some issues. You might not get the change in cervical range of motion that you oh so desire. And think about this. When we're looking at hyoid positioning, what are we trying to measure? What is that analogous for? And, to, again, give kudos to Daddy-O Pops about the concepts of iterations. The infrasternal angle, the infrapubic angle, and the hyoid are all looking at similar things in their respective areas. And each of these things are proxy measures for the visceral dynamics that are underlying. With the infrapubic angle, you're looking at how well you can mobilize the viscera, aka the goods, within the pelvis and some of your stomach contents as well. With the infrasternal angle, you're looking at the dynamic capabilities of the guts and airflow into the chest, which we can't directly measure the mobility of those specific internal things. But what is the viscera that we're measuring when we're looking at the hyoid? Well, folks, believe it or not, you can directly measure that. So instead of using a proxy, why don't you actually look at the viscera that you're looking at to see if that's dynamic? Wait a minute, what viscera am I talking about? Folks, I'm talking about the tongue. That bad boy right there. Which, yeah, I got that good flexibility because your boy got that tongue tie release. Boom. The tongue is the big deciding factor when it comes to the mobility or lack thereof of the hyoid. If your tongue is sitting low, that's going to change cervical spine orientation. That's going to change how well we can breathe through our nose. That's going to change the pharyngeal wall space, which can negatively impact the airway. And your neck could do compensatory strategies to try to keep the airway open. If we look at someone who's got a military head posture, why would that be advantageous? It's not like these bad postures, which are not really bad, are done because your body hates you. They're done likely to create a specific adaptation to ensure your survival. So why would a military neck be useful? If I assume upper cervical flexion with a military posture, what does that do to the mandible? At the mandible, what will happen is the mandible will actually protrude. Why is that something you want to have sometimes? Well, when the mandible protrudes, what that does is it increases the space in the upper airway. Why is it a lot of times that if you get a dental appliance or some type of splint, that they'll put something on the lowers to help bring the jaw down and forward? The reason why they might do that, especially if you're someone who's got sleep apnea or an airway issue, is because when the jaw comes down and forward, that helps increase the airway dimensions. If someone has a low resting tongue posture for whatever reason, what I mean by that is instead of the tongue being plastered up against the roof of the mouth, it sits down and back in the throat, which encroaches in the airway because the pharyngeal wall then collapses and you can't breathe as well. If I flex my neck, the jaw is going to come more forward, which will help open up the airway to some degree, but it's done so with a compensatory strategy. And folks, if you can't breathe, you think your body gives piddly diddly about the hyoid dynamics? No, not at all. Breathing is going to take the top priority because you want to stay alive. Survival is number one. So do we have to drive a bunch of air in the chest? Yes. Do we have to take into account neck orientation? Absolutely. But if you're not addressing tongue position, you're probably going to fall short with this specific presentation. So instead of looking at hyoid dynamics with this particular person, you might actually look at tongue skills. And no, not the tongue skills that you did under the bleachers in high school, folks. I'm talking about tongue range of motion. Can you attain a palatal tongue posture? And can your tongue do all the things that it needs to do from a movement perspective to ensure it has full dynamics, which then, folks, and this is the key thing when we're talking about the hyoid, sets you up for swallowing dynamics, because that's really when we need the hyoid to move. When you swallow, the hyoid should elevate, and then when you complete the swallow, it should depress. So if you don't have those things set up, you got problems. First, you want to look at tongue range of motion. There's three things that you're going to look at to see what the range of motion looks like. If you want to really dive into this, I would definitely check out the course review that I did for myofunctional therapy class that I took through AOMT, and definitely check out AOMT if you haven't given them a chance, because they give an amazing overview of all things myofunctional. That is the place to learn this stuff. Three things. First, look at mandibular opening. You want to see how much that is. Ideally, you're looking for about 40 to 45 millimeters. And then what you're going to do is you're going to compare two different tongue postures to see if one has any anterior tongue restrictions or posterior tongue restrictions. For the anterior tongue restrictions, you're going to look at tongue tip up to the rugae. The rugae is the rough patch that is just behind your teeth. If you take your thumb, put it right behind your teeth, you'll feel a rough spot. That's the rugae. When you say the letter N and you feel where your tongue tip hits, that is the tip spot that we're looking at for this measure. It's going to look like so. And you'll see, comparing my regular opening to my tongue tip open, pretty comparable. You're also looking to see if anyone's using any compensatory things. Maybe they got to move their neck in some crazy way or make weird faces as they do it. We want, ideally, the face and the neck to be relaxed because you're checking the range of motion. The next thing you want to look at is the cave. The cave is essentially plastering the entire tongue up on the roof of your mouth, which will help give you an indication of any posterior tongue restrictions. It looks like this. And ideally, it should be roughly the same as the other two. If you have any limitations there, you might do moves to address those range of motion restrictions. There's a ton of different moves that you could perform on this. Some of my beginning ones would be for an anterior restriction, a palate brush, which basically you take the tip of your tongue on the roof of your mouth and you just slide it back and forth along your palate. That's a great way to get anterior range of motion. If you need some posterior stuff, doing cheek punches, which you can bite with 2 knuckles and push your tongue as far as you can to either side, holding for 5 counts. Those are usually my first 2 go-tos for most people. So it'll look kind of like so. Those are great ways to increase range of motion. Now, I do want to specify, if you have someone who's severely restricted, and this is where you need to seek out someone who's really qualified at measuring this stuff, or someone who's experienced myofunctional therapy, you can have tongue ties that are significant enough that a surgical fix would likely be the case. If someone has less than 50% range of motion, according to some of the research by Dr. Sarush Zagi, who did my tongue tie, generally that would be a surgical indication. And also the location of the tongue tie can play a role as well. Like if it's way in the front, probably got to get that snipped. Once you have full range of motion, then you're looking at, can you maintain a palatal tongue posture? Which what that is the tongue tip going up to the spot, aka the rugae, that letter N spot. And then can you get the rest of the tongue to plaster up there? 2, the third thing, can you breathe through your nose comfortably? Make sure your face and neck stay relaxed. Obviously, I can't show you unless you got x-ray vision, which, if that's the case. But if you got x-ray vision, you would see that my tongue is completely plastered up against the roof of my mouth. And I can breathe easily, unlabored. That would be the second thing that you'd want to focus on. And the third thing would be all of the various tongue skills that your tongue should be able to do. So can you stick your tongue out without any compensatory things in the neck? You know, there's tons of different shapes. Can you make the taco? Can you do a bowl? Can you do lots of stuff? Check the myofunctional post to see if you can work through all those skills so you can shape your tongue into all the different positions possible. But if you can do that, if you have good range of motion, if you have the ability to get the tongue up to the roof of the mouth, if you have all of the tongue dynamics available, you're probably going to be in a good spot at that point. Now, once you've done all that, and you've gotten good cervical positioning, you're able to get air into the front of the chest, then your terminal exercise will be to work on swallow progressions, which will ensure that you have full dynamic excursion of the hyoid. And as you're doing swallows, you want to make sure that your tongue kind of essentially does this whipping effect. You don't want to jut the tongue forward or out into the sides. You want your neck and your facial muscles to stay relaxed as you do it. And you shouldn't have any other compensatory activities. An easy drill to work on that after you've done all this stuff. Careful, folks. You don't want to progress too quickly into this because a lot of times if you have someone who's still got some severe restrictions, sometimes working on swallowing can increase symptoms, which we don't want. But if you get your luscious Topo Chico, you can take a swig of water, keep it on the roof of your mouth, try to hold it in place. It's called a water trap or a water cave, and then swallow without any compensatory things like so. Here's to you, fam. And there's your swallow. To me, that's the terminal exercise when it comes to restoring hyoid dynamics. And those are the big keys when it comes to this particular presentation. To summarize, David, whatever you want to go with, your wonderful, sexy question. Major keys: military posture, OA flexion, lower cervical extension, concentric suprahyoid, eccentric infrahyoid, unless you got a loss of IR. In that case, you got concentric on the top, concentric down low. The solution is to make all of those areas eccentric as can be. You basically want to flip-flop all the contractile orientations. Step 1, drive air into the front of the chest so you get the IR back. Step 2, get OA extension so your head's in a good position. Asterisk to step 2, because the real step 2, 3-ish sort of thing is making sure you have good tongue placement, which would be ensuring you have full tongue range motion. You can get your tongue plastered up against the roof of your mouth. It's as dynamic as can be. You can do all the various tongue skills that your tongue should be able to do. And last but not least, you can attain a swallow without any compensatory activities. And if you do those things, you're going to be undouble chinning like a boss. You're going to have a hyoid that's as dynamic as can be. And most importantly, folks, you ought to be in business. Unbelievable question, David. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. And before you hang off on IG, if you want to learn more about getting air into the front of the chest because you got that military head and you're like, I don't know what to do. Well, the place to learn is Human Matrix, my seminar. The next one that's coming up is in May 29th and 30th. This one is happening, folks. Boston, Massachusetts. If you are in that area, definitely come check it out. We're going to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep it the safest seminar in the land. In terms of what we'll be doing specifically, I'm going to wait and see what the CDC recommends because they kind of tell me what to do to ensure your safety and well-being. If you aren't in Boston, well, there's a lot of other places we'll be at, folks. August 14th and 15th, Ann Arbor, Michigan. September 25th and 26th in Wyckoff, New Jersey. October 23rd and 4th in Philly. November 6th and 7th, Charlotte, North Carolina. I got a few others in the works, so you definitely want to check that out. Give it a shot if you are looking to get air in the front of the chest. But maybe you're like, okay, that's cool, but I need to figure out a little bit more what to do upstairs in the neck and the tongue. Well, folks, you can learn about that at zachcouples.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter because you will get access to a bunch of free stuff. You're going to get access to Human Matrix Foundations, my free course that you can take to help your learning gains get on point. Or if you need someone to look under the hood, and by the hood, I mean maybe the mouth or neck positioning, and because you're unsure what you really need, a movement consultation is a great way to make that happen. What we can do is I will evaluate you remotely, see if you have any particular restrictions, walk you through what you need to do to be successful, and increase your movement capabilities so you can be a legend. Folks, you could also do online training with me if you want to take those movement restrictions, but you also want to improve your fitness capabilities. That's a great way to do it. Unfortunately, right now, I am completely booked out, but if you want to get on the wait list for online training, you can sign up at zachcouples.com. Or if you just want to learn how to do all this stuff with your Supreme clientele, the Mentorship Program is a great way to do that. Because what we can do is we can look at cases, help you with any didactic issues or understanding issues that you may be limited in. And most importantly, I'll help you troubleshoot through your coaching, cases, anything else that you need to be rocking it. Once you've scoured zachcouples.com, you've read every blog, you've signed up for the newsletter, you spent every service with me that you possibly could, where can you go next? The answer, folks, is Apple Podcasts and Stitcher by searching The Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There are 147 other debriefs out there, and, the cool light wasn't always there. We didn't have 2 cameras, that's for sure. You definitely might listen to me on the older ones instead of looking at me. I get it. While you're there, though, please leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Other places you can find me is on the social medias. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, search Z Couples. I'm on YouTube, search Zach Couples. Folks, if you want to know some good exercises to perform with your peeps based on their movement restrictions, YouTube is the place to do it. And last but not least, you can find me on that Instagram, baby, at Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I hope that you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.